Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining the first quarterly CTAC meeting for the eTruck project for the 2025 calendar year. My name is Giovanni Hernandez, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all today to a very exciting uh, topic that we'll be discussing with some guest presenters that we're really happy to have from our partners over at SCAG and ICF. Um, Before we get started, would love to just go through some housekeeping items. Next slide, please. There you go. Thank you so much. So just a quick agenda for today's meeting. As always, we'll provide a quick overview of the project and uh, the uh, the goals and focus of the CTAC body for this project. We'll provide some overall project updates that we have to share with you all. And then from there, we will hand it over to our guest presenters to discuss some citing criteria presentation that our guest presenters have prepared for you all. Then, as always, we have some discussion questions. We'll open it up for Q&A as well for any questions that you all may have for us, for the eTruck team, or our guest presenters. And of course, would love any feedback that you all have on the presentation project, etc. And with that, let's do some quick team introductions. Again, I'm Giovanni Hernandez, Clean Mobility Program Manager with the Grid Alternatives of the Greater Los Angeles office. And with that, I'll toss it over to my colleague Stella.
Good morning, Giovanni. Good morning, everyone. And thank you to Jonathan and Sam for participating in this particular webinar. We really appreciate your expertise today. Stella Ursua from the Grid Alternatives Greater LA office. I'm the Director of Community Engagement and Partnerships. Thank you so much. And I'll hand it over to Aaron. Is Aaron on the call today?
Yeah, Aaron's not with us today, but
Oh, okay.
yeah, Gia is here.
Very good, Giovanna. Your turn.
Thank you, Stella.
Mhm.
Giovanna Escamilla. I'm an associate project manager here at CalStart. Yeah, thank you so much to everybody for joining, and I can't wait for today's presentation. And then I'll pass it over to Liz.
Thanks, Gia. Liz Hellier, lead project manager on the Clean Fusion Infrastructure team at CalStart. Happy to be here.
And then also, if Lisa could also introduce herself as part of the CalStart team, that's a crucial member of the eTruck project as well.
Hi, good morning. My name is Lisa Wagner. I facilitate project outreach for CalStart and the eTruck project. Thanks everybody for joining us this morning and looking forward to the presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Liz, Gia, and Lisa. With that, let's move on. Take it away, Gia.
All right. Thank you. So here is a quick project overview for anyone who may be new to the project or who needs a refresher. So eTruck's purpose is to create a California research hub to accelerate the electrification of the heavy-duty drayage vehicle market. There's three main objectives and goals of this project. So eTruck looks to advance the research and development activities that extend the delivery range of battery electric trucks, beginning with drayage operations. eTruck also engages with stakeholders with a community-first approach to promote equity and workforce development opportunities in priority communities affected by the goods movement. Lastly, eTruck is planning and deploying innovative, scalable public corridor charging strategies for heavy-duty electric trucks. And again, this begins with drayage.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gia. And before I move on to this next slide, I do want to encourage all of our attendees to introduce yourself in the chat, name, organization that you're with. Also, I do recognize that there might be some new folks attending for the first time. If I don't have your email address, please feel free to input your email address into the chat. I'd love to make sure that you receive a copy of the recording, a copy of the presentation of this meeting. That's something that we follow up with after every meeting. And so love to have your email to make sure you're included in those emails as well. So as a quick overview of the Community First Technology Advisory Committee, or CTAC for short, the goal is to have a community first engagement framework for the project to ensure that pollution impacted, underserved, and tribal communities are involved in creating and guiding the initiative at every step, every phase of the project, right? And so, one of the objectives is to ensure that CTAC members that we have different nonprofits, community-based organizations, environmental justice groups, labor, industry partners, academia that all come together. Also, members that are from local government that join us for these meetings. And so we would love at every step of the way to ensure that we are informing all of the different stakeholders of the project, solicit feedback and input, right? And at the same time that all of these different stakeholders and partners assist us in disseminating updates, information on the project to the community, to their stakeholders, on project activities. And of course, along the way, ensure that we are promoting equity in all of the priority communities, and that we foster a community-driven partnership for the advancement of technology, zero-emission freight corridor development, the planning and site prioritization, which we're here to talk about today on that particular item. So as you hear today's presentation, keep in mind that we would love to also hear any additional input and feedback that you have from what you hear today that we can ensure to apply to this project as we continue to move forward. So with that, I'll kick it back over to Gia for overall project updates to share with you all.
Okay, thank you. So we have a lot of great updates coming out of the eTruck project right now, starting with the ZEV Training Hub. So this is our interactive workforce navigation tool that's now live on the eTruck website with over 60 programs across California, and this will be updated regularly. So if you come across a program that doesn't happen to be in the inventory, please send it over via the contact button on eTruck's website. We also have our industry partner webinar series. So the next and last webinar of the series will be on April 9th of this year. And this topic will be EV Site Planning 101. And we're going to have a great presentation from partners at Zeem Solutions. For the Advanced Transportation Research Center, this is now open for Phase A testing at SCE's EV Charging Laboratory in Pomona, California, and Phase B testing should be ready by the end of Q1. The pilot demonstration sites, these pilot sites in Ontario and Carson are expected to finish construction later this year. The Regional Freight Heat Map 2.0. So 1.0 has been live on the eTruck website, and now we're working on a second version, which incorporates an equity layer that's being informed by community members like yourselves on our advisory committee. Our workforce development mapping tool, the accompanying methodology memo for this is complete, and we're working on incorporating eTruck's modeling results and visualization. So look for this one on the website in the coming months. And then lastly, just the technology transfer activities. You can scan the QR code right there with your phone, and it'll take you to the link tree that gets you access to all of our social media platforms. And last one that's not up here, if you live in the San Bernardino area and would like to see an EV truck up close and maybe even test drive it, there's a ride and drive event this Friday, March 7th at the National Orange Show. So you can click the link in our link tree to sign up and learn more. I will pass it back to you, Giovanni.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gia. So as many of you know, the eTruck team has provided a presentation on siting prioritization criteria for the eTruck project in one of our most recent quarterly meetings. However, the team felt that it would be beneficial to have our partners from the Southern California Association of Governments, SCAG, and ICF to elaborate further on how developing siting criteria translates into developing a siting tool, site assessments, and eventually into a siting prioritization criteria. So the goal for today's meeting is to present this kind of information to our CTAC to impart knowledge on the process, what goes into site selection, and how decisions are made. And keeping that in mind with what you hear on the presentation, what additional input and feedback you have for the team that maybe you think is missing that you didn't hear about today. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our guest presenters for today. We're really excited to have today Jonathan Raspa, Senior Planner and ZETI Project Manager over at Southern California Association of Governments, and Sam Pornazeri, Director of Clean Transportation and Energy at ICF. Thank you both so much for your time, and for being here with us. I'll kick it over to you both. Take it away.
Great. I'll go ahead and get started really quickly. It's great to be here. My name is Jonathan Raspa. I was the project manager for the Zero Emission Truck Infrastructure Study, a bit of a mouthful at SCAG. We're wrapping up that study and we're getting ready to start getting the information and tools out to the region to support zero emission infrastructure implementation. Sam, do you want to give a quick intro?
Thanks, Jonathan. Good morning, everyone. Sam Pornazeri, Senior Director of Clean Transportation Energy at ICF. And I had the pleasure of working with Jonathan at SCAG and specifically on the siting criteria and siting assessment part of the ZETI project.
Great. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the site prioritization tool and the different factors that went into developing the criteria and how they were applied and sort of what those results looked like. So our siting prioritization tool was a parcel-based tool that really served to screen out of the 5 million parcels in the SCAG region, which ones were most appropriate for development for truck charging infrastructure. It was not a tool that was supposed to say you must develop a charging site at this location, at this size, but really to help kind of refine down from that large number and then give either developers or site owners a chance to then sort of explore options a little bit further. Like it says in that last bullet, this is not a substitute for full-blown site analysis and design. And then any operator or developer would also have to consider how their specific business model or operations would be served by developing that site. So everything will look a little bit different for everyone, but it really helped us kind of drill down into all of the information we gathered during the ZETI project. We looked at 3 different interval years, 2030, 2035, and 2040. We looked at different site sizes, small, medium, and large, with different numbers of chargers and square footage. We looked at battery electric and hydrogen fueling infrastructure. We're going to be focusing on the battery electric side today, since that's also the main objective of the eTruck project. And we considered a lot of different factors. Some of those layers are actually built into the tool to sort of help support understanding the context of higher or lower scoring sites. Next slide, please. And before I go any further, I have to give a big tip of the hat to Sam and his team. ICF was instrumental in helping develop this tool, really validate all of our different criteria, and then actually building out the web tool itself. So again, thanks, Sam, to you and your team. So there were 5 main groups of siting criteria for developing charging infrastructure prioritization. They were the overall utilization of the parcel by different trucking fleets, sort of characteristics of the land. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out a good way to incorporate equity considerations into the prioritization process. Another really important one, again, is grid capacity. Is there power at that site, and is there enough for trucks to utilize it for charging? and then environmental considerations to sort of screen out, include or exclude parcels. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go into some of those criteria really quickly. There's a lot of detail here. I'm not going to drill down too far, but just to give a kind of a good overview with enough detail so you can all understand how we kind of dug into each one of these. So the first one, utilization, we looked at both charging demand, so how much electricity was demanded by regional trucking fleets at that particular site. And that was driven by another part of the ZETI project where we simulated at a very detailed level actual truck trips throughout the state, and then figured out exactly where they were charging, how long they were charging, how much energy was used. So that information was brought directly into the site prioritization tool. Daily travel is how many miles of truck travel are generated by that site. This is a little bit generalized, but basically how much VMT sort of in an area around the site was generated by trucks. And that was again part of the initial heavy load and truck modeling work. And that was analyzed at the TAZ level, if anyone's familiar with travel demand modeling. So a little bit bigger than a parcel. We're not looking at like, a whole city kind of all in one. So those two were big, important factors. We want to be sure that we were serving trucks where they needed energy the most, and where there was a lot of truck travel already being generated. We didn't want to put sites in places that maybe there wasn't a lot of energy demand or trucks weren't already starting out or going to. So next slide, please. This is the big one. So the land criteria, just, sort of what's the context of the specific site. We looked at parking, the size of it, whether it was large enough to scale in the future. We know that demand is going to ramp up over time as more fleets transitions to zero emission. We took a high level look at land price, and we didn't look at the cost of every single parcel in the SCAG region. That's well beyond the scope of our project, but we did kind of take a generalized cost of industrial land within each zip code throughout the region and applied that. We looked at zoning, and we actually used that as a screening criteria. We basically excluded any parcels that were residential. We only focused on industrial, commercial, or open space sites. We also eliminated areas that were protected land, so under Bureau of Land Management or other factors that made them inappropriate for development. We also looked at the proximity to other zero emission infrastructure. While there is an interest in some ways of keeping a lot of this truck charging within industrial districts, there's also demand outside of them. If there was existing zero emission infrastructure, we said, do we want to keep it concentrated, or do we want to sort of spread it out so there's more of a distributed impact of all these trucks going to charge at some of these sites? We looked at amenities sort of around the parcel, so whether hotels, restaurants, other things that truckers could use to sort of make their trip a little more enjoyable while waiting for their vehicle to charge, right? This wasn't a 15-minute fueling stop. This was, in some cases, 30 minutes, an hour, or 2 hours of charging. And then we looked at access, congestion, and safety. So, were there high levels of congestion around the site? Was it within a certain proximity of the highway? And what we don't want to do is start sending a lot of trucks down, say, one particular residential road, or down one main arterial, and it's conflicting with other travel in the area, creating safety or congestion issues. Next slide, please. The next one, equity criteria. This is something that we took a lot of time sort of trying to figure out. We looked at a couple of different measures of equity. So we used the SB 535 or CalEnviroscreen communities layer. We looked at the Justice 40 layer that was put out by US DOT. We looked at SCAG's got its own equity communities layer, and we settled on using the SB 535 communities as the best measure of equity that was applicable sort of up and down the state, right? We didn't want to choose something that was only specific to DOT. We wanted to make sure that using an equity layer that reflected federal, state, and local funding priorities would make it so that we were targeting disadvantaged communities that could then leverage this information into applying for funding for site development or other programs that would support zero emission vehicle charging. So the first criteria was proximity to disadvantaged communities, or DAC for short. So just, is the site close to or far away from disadvantaged communities? What we didn't want to do was cite new basically zero emission truck stops within disadvantaged communities, especially those that already bore a high proportion of the impacts of existing truck travel. Right, we put a charging site there, even more trucks are going to be going to those locations. So that this criteria sort of worked in reverse. If the site was in close proximity to the DAC, it got a lower score. The other one, so direct benefit. I'm sorry. I just got those reversed. Pardon me. So what this did was this basically gave a higher score to sites that were just outside of disadvantaged communities. So basically, if it was located outside, it got a higher score. If it was located inside, it got a lower score. So citing these truck charging sites just outside of disadvantaged communities, right? Not bringing that truck travel into the disadvantaged community census tracts. And then the other one, direct benefit to DAC, this gave a higher score to parcels that were within disadvantaged communities, right? If they are bearing a higher proportion of truck travel, emissions, noise, and safety concerns, bringing zero emission trucks would at least eliminate some of those impacts, right, around emissions, noise. So we sort of developed these two criteria to work not in an opposite direction, but to sort of depending on sort of policy priorities or community needs. If they wanted more zero emission sites or just fewer trucks overall, you could use either of these to kind of drive your scores in one way or another. Next slide, please. The next one was grid capacity. This is a pretty difficult set of data to get a hold of at a granular level. So we were looking at grid capacity a little bit of a higher level. We got information from Los Angeles Department of Water and Power and SoCal Edison to help us understand not so much how much capacity was available, but total load capacity. It's very difficult to find out sort of how much existing demand is in place on a sort of circuit, as well as the overall total capacity. So we use total load capacity as a proxy. Again, this was tough information to get a hold of. It's very difficult to kind of analyze every single parcel's available electrical load, but this does sort of help us generalize and focus on areas that had more load capacity on their circuits. There's unfortunately no sort of regional data set that kind of does that at a detailed level. And that's really something that should be evaluated when you're kind of moving into the next stage to develop a site. But we didn't want to ignore it. So we tried to work this in using the existing total load capacity for the site. The other one was just DER, or distributed energy resources integration. So, does the site have the capacity and the space to add solar panels, battery backup system? We also considered including the idea of a hydrogen fuel cell as a sort of backup energy generator. And the idea here being that during sort of peak demand times, when there's a lot of trucks needing to charge, that was midday for sort of smaller delivery trucks, and then sort of midday and overnight for heavy duty trucks. How could the sites meet the need maybe when energy was more expensive or just less available overall? And the idea being you would use solar panels and a battery backup system to sort of store energy to offset peak demand. And that was really important, especially for larger sites that could experience just really high peak demand at sort of major truck trip generating sites, or somewhere that just had sort of multiple hours of sustained peak demand, where either the grid or just a solar system on its own couldn't supply all of that energy demanded when vehicles are charging. So that was the idea here with grid capacity. It also avoided the cost of, oh, that's okay, you can stay on that slide. It also just helps avoid the cost of having to add even more grid capacity to a site that has really high peak demand. It sort of brings that cost down a little bit. So next slide, please. Excuse me. And then the last one was environmental criteria. So this considers, what are the risks around the environment for some of these sites? And so there's a whole host of these that were already included in the disadvantaged communities criteria. Cal Enviroscreen looks at a lot of different environmental considerations and ranks those parcels or those census tracts accordingly. But we also wanted to look at two additional criteria. So is there a high potential for flooding hazards or sea level rise impacts here? We don't want to cite these this sort of critical infrastructure in an area that will be affected in the next 10, 20, or 50 years. This is extremely costly infrastructure to build, especially on the grid side, and we want to make sure it's there for the long term. Something else we didn't consider at the time, but will actually be working into this, is what is also the fire hazard risk for a lot of these parcels within the SCAG region. This past January, these fires have had an incredible impact and a sort of rethinking of resilience for Southern California. That's very apparent to everyone with the disasters that affected the Palisades and Altadena communities. So we're going to be looking at that as well, and either potentially augmenting or just sort of maybe adding that as a supplemental layer in our mapping tool. The second one was brownfield development. So there's a lot of sites out there that are contaminated. They're former gas stations, former industrial land. They maybe don't rise to the level of being a Superfund site that need really extensive mitigation, but there is still contaminated soil there nonetheless, and there should be a way to mitigate that. And so one idea was that you could cap these brownfields, not have that contaminated soil blowing around, could use them as sort of like basically create a parking lot out of it, but also locate the zero emission charging infrastructure there so that there isn't really costly mitigation required on a site that won't be developed for residential or park use or commercial use, that it's going to be primarily an industrial site. But this sort of helped mitigate some of the effects of just leaving that as open space and put it towards a better use to support, zero emission charging. Next slide, please. So really quick recap of the statistics. So there's 5 million parcels in the SCAG region. There were very few that met kind of the base land use screening criteria, about 460,000. And then of those 460,000, further 160,000 were cut because they just weren't large enough, right? You're not going to charge just one truck. It's very expensive to develop this infrastructure. And so the idea being you want to have sites that are big enough to support demand. So you can see here kind of the breakdown. It's like the chart got cut off a little bit here of small, medium, and large sites. And then you can actually see the energy demand is very skewed. For most sites, it's very, very low out of those 300,000 or so that met that land use and space criteria. So there's only a few sites that have really high energy demand, and that's encouraging because that means you don't have to develop a massive amount of grid capacity at every single truck charging location. Some can meet their needs with either existing or kind of smaller grid upgrades in the near term, and then you can sort of build them out to scale in the longer term, or think about using solar and battery backup to supplement future demand. Could we just advance just once, please? Perfect. So the other thing we were looking at was load capacity, and there was a bit of a mismatch between load capacity and charging demand. But the other thing was that of all of the existing sites, we had sort of general load capacity information around. A little over 5,000 met either partial or all of the demand that we thought would be needed in 2030, 2035, and 2040. So there is capacity out there. It's really just a matter of using it, finding it and using it before moving to, requiring really costly and kind of long-term grid upgrades for every single site where you're seeking to develop. And then the other chart here, you can see kind of the overall score breakdown. And you can see it's sort of skewed towards lower scores, but what that really tells us is that there are no perfect sites for this, right? There's a lot of competing demand for land in Southern California. There's a lot of sort of other contextual components that drive their suitability for zero emission charging infrastructure. And so we shouldn't be out searching for the perfect location. It told us, there are some sites here that meet some of the criteria and they'd be a great reason to develop. There's others that meet other criteria that put them in a good category for maybe future development, maybe not development right now. And so, we have to kind of take a holistic approach and not sort of be the enemy of the good. What is it? We need to not look for the perfect site, right? We need to find opportunities where we can. So this overall score too was driven by a set of criteria developed by the ZETI Project's Technical Advisory Committee. So they sort of responded to a survey and ranked for us what were the most important criteria out of all of the ones I just went through. And that was the basis for these scores. We also knew that this tool would want to be used by other groups, other agencies who had maybe different sets of policy goals or priorities in how they would rank different sites. And so ICF put a lot of work into building this out so that the weights are adjustable, they're flexible. We really utilize almost all of the criteria in this, and that sort of drove the scores a little bit lower overall. But you could also focus on a couple of key criteria like, let's just make sure we're serving energy demand, or let's have a mix of energy demand, existing infrastructure, and locating sites outside of disadvantaged communities. And that would give you a different set of scores and sort of a different distribution within the region. So again, overall, this is a flexible tool. We do see that there's the ability to meet demand with some existing sites. It's really about using this tool to screen parcels and then work with site developers, work with local jurisdictions to sort of strategically locate them. And you'll see in the next couple slides, we sort of saw sites score well in areas where we expected around major freight corridors, major industrial sites, the ports, the downtown rail yards. This is an example right here in just south of downtown Los Angeles. It's adjacent to rail yards, intermodal facilities, a whole host of industrial sites and warehouse uses. You can see one of the highest scoring parcels actually in the whole tool for the default scores was this, sort of existing warehouse use. There's a couple of, misidentified sites where it's a rail yard, but for the most part, we can see that it's lining up with the existing land use and sort of truck travel patterns. So that tells us right away, this is a great site. This is an existing use that trucks are utilizing, and there's a lot of trips coming out of here. There'll be high energy demand. This is a site we should, sort of investigate further, or the other kind of light blue sites around it. Next slide, please. Perfect. Yeah. So this is a sort of second area on Rancho Dominguez. It's between Compton and Gardena off the 110. This is just, these are sites with scores from 4 to 6, right? So sort of middle, but there's a lot of them in an area. So there's a lot of opportunity here for sort of scattered, sort of smaller scale distributed sites that would make sense and sort of support either smaller to medium-sized fleets in the area. You can also see there's a couple of undeveloped parcels that are in the middle of this industrial use, so maybe not the best location for maybe developing new housing, but this could be maybe like one large sort of supercharging site where all of these uses in this industrial area, are using that for recharging either during the day or, doing sort of lower powered charging overnight. Next slide, please. Perfect. And this is a third area. This is where we sort of have to sort of put our thinking hats on and, be aware that lower scoring sites, even though they didn't score particularly well, are still good sites with opportunities for development. This is south of the Ontario airport. This is sort of the Harupa and the Harupa Valley. There's like a major commercial district here. There's a ton of freight moving through this region. It's between the 10 and the 60 and the 15. Ontario moves a lot of freight out of that location, out of the airport. And even though it's low scoring, it's critical in this really high industrial concentration to develop some of these charging sites, within here, small, medium, and large. To not do so would have a couple of sort of negative consequences. It would try to shift the charging of those trucks somewhere else and massively increase, VMT of those trucks sort of going on highways and local streets. It would shift them potentially closer to residential areas where we don't necessarily want trucks parked overnight and charging. The other thing is this gets trucks sort of off the highway right to their charging site or their local destination, and then right back onto the highway. It's not diverting them far away from highways. Most fleet operators don't want to go that far away from a major interstate or state route. They want to stay sort of, kind of on their major paths of travel, make their delivery, make their pickup, and then get right back on the highway and go to their next trip. So again, even though they're low scoring parcels, still critical to develop new infrastructure here. So next slide, please. And I think I saw a couple questions pop up in the chat. Let's see. If you don't mind, I'll answer this. Actually, Commissioner, but I'll let you go ahead first, and then I'll go to the chat.
Okay. Yes, good morning. Thank you for the great presentation. I think it was an excellent approach. And I guess I'm asking for maybe some clarification. When it comes to brownfield sites, and you said capping off the area, is that a full guarantee that existing contamination cannot infiltrate? Let's say, for instance, if the city has its own, if they have their own water system. So does that guarantee that still the water system will not be negatively impacted by the existing contamination?
So I'm not a hydrology engineer, but I can speak a little bit to this. It doesn't guarantee that completely. Again, the tool isn't a complete substitution for like a full-blown site analysis if someone was to go into developing a particular site. But if, say, a jurisdiction wanted to make the best use of brownfield sites sort of kind of within its boundaries that it knew weren't going to get developed for housing, maybe they weren't big enough for full-scale industrial development, but they could cite some small charges here. It would be a way to, sort of utilize that land in a better way than just leaving it vacant because, maybe the level of cleanup needed for park or residential development is a little bit too high, but maintaining it as an industrial site would suffice. So I don't want to say it would guarantee it,
Right. Yes.
but it does help sort of identify those parcels within the context of charging infrastructure.
Right. I agree with you. So it has me wondering, I know that, there's funding for like brownfield cleanup. At what point are we um requiring some type of CEQA and remediation? Um, or it's just not on the table at this point. Thank you.
I would just say I don't think that could be addressed by this in particular. You would need an actual project first to then sort of go through the CEQA process. Is this a project or is it not? Initial study, what mitigation is required, if any. So that would kind of come subsequent to identifying parcels and moving through the project development process. So
Thank you so much.
you're welcome. And then we had one question in the chat. Is there a step where parcels look at future city development / land use plans? Looking ahead could help ensure sites align with how areas might evolve over time or identify parcels to transition to industrial mixed use zoning. So there is a little bit of that in here. So the truck trip modeling, so not the charging simulation, but the trip modeling utilized future land use planning. This is part of what SCAG and other cities do as part of their 4-step model. And so it does incorporate, growth in the region, population increases or decreases, and changes in land use that were incorporated into the modeling work. So yes, it's there. I would say it's not at the detailed level that, we know that someone has applied for a permit to develop X, Y, or Z in this location. That's just a little too granular to do across the region. This was more of a high level look to help sort of zoom into, where are the sort of best areas for opportunities. So yes and no. But again, the tool is primarily for screening and focusing for areas for future opportunities. Does that answer your question? That was Michael Nahara from Bike LA.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Okay, if there's no more questions, I'm going to hand right off to Sam. He's going to go ahead and talk through the site assessments themselves. ICF was also key in developing this, so he is really the expert here. So Sam, go ahead.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next slide, please. Given the leftover time, I'm probably going to go a little quicker through this. But as Jonathan said, I mean, the siting tool was a great tool, not just because ICF developed it, but it was a really great tool for screening. I mean, for going from enormous number of parcels of 5 million down to a handful number of parcels that a developer, a planner, or whoever else, a funding agency can look for and doing further investigations. But as Jonathan also said, right up front and also in one of the responses, I mean, it is not necessarily going to give you the final answer. It's going to give you a range of different parcels that you need to further investigate. So as part of this, the ZETI study, one of the additional steps we took was that we didn't necessarily go and analyze all of those thousands of 5,000 sites that were roughly high score, but we sort of tried to also put a framework of when a developer, a planner, a funding agency is going to do further investigations on a site, what sort of factors they need to look for. And in order to do that, we started bringing a couple of examples. So the examples we brought in were grouped into different use cases of sites. Sites that are for on-route refueling or on-route recharging, sites that are near destinations, like major destinations like ports. I mean, sites within urban areas and sites within mixed-use cases, like there are highway end destinations or urban use cases. So we try to look at some of these sites to provide the different typologies of the charging infrastructure sites. Next slide, please. So with those in mind, we went ahead and picked 12 charging sites under different conditions. Like these 12 were among 4 different use cases that I presented in the previous slide, and also sites that can handle small number of chargers, medium size number of chargers, and large number of chargers, like 10, 25, 40 chargers, because the land space needed for these different sizes of charging infrastructure could vary. So that's why you're seeing roughly around 12 sites on this map. I mean, some of those are within the urban area, some of those are on highway, which are on route charging, some of those are near major destinations, and some of them were kind of like the mixed use. Next slide, please. So not only we did this for electric, but we also did it for hydrogen. But the sites that I'm going to present today, an example that I'm going to present today, if you roll through the animation, please, is for an electric charging for a medium size charging facility under a mixed use scenario. Next slide. So on the top left, you can see the site that we have selected. We intentionally didn't provide the address on these sites, not to imply that this is the site that everyone needs to go and start doing the development, because this was really just an example site of just showing what sort of considerations. And for each of these sites, we developed like a 2-pager information in terms of like what you really need to consider when it comes to a site assessments. Like, I mean, if you go to the next slide, please. Like, for example, the very first thing was trying to really understand, like, where, first of all, did the siting tool actually pick the right site or not? I mean, there are so many criteria that are being used, up to 15 criteria that basically try to use and score each site, and trying to really look at the land use as a very first, I mean, filtering or screening method, trying to figure out, like, is this site really in the right place? For example, on this specific site, I mean, this site is really surrounded by a lot of the industrial land uses, lots of warehouses and a lot of industrial, and there seems to be a lot of truck traffic here. Next one, next slide, please. We also looked at the scores coming out of the tool, as well as, I mean, which are shown on the bottom left, as well as the energy demand for not specifically this site, but the regions in the vicinity of this site. And we realized, yeah, I mean, when you look at this site, while the score is 2.4, because I mean, the site doesn't have the load capacity, the site cannot accommodate, I mean, distributed energy resources, it's not a brownfield, and it is in proximity to some other charging infrastructure. That's why it's getting a score of 0. But there are a lot of other criteria that are actually pretty appealing. On the other hand, we also looked at the energy demand on this side and the charging events as estimated by the heavy load to figure out whether the site really, I mean, once it get developed, is it going to have a return on investment for a developer to actually, or is it going to be profitable for them, or will there be a return on investments and a utilization that will makes the economics work for them. And those are the type of energy demand and charging events that we looked at coming out of the model for the area in the vicinity of the site. In addition to those, there are some general characteristics that we looked at, for each of these sites. For example, is this an existing truck parking? Can it accommodate 30 trucks? What is the available load capacity right now? Like, for example, based on the SCE integration capacity analysis maps, the ICA tools, for example, we realized the circuit serving this site has already about 0.8 megawatt of load, but given that 10 chargers for heavy duty trucks could be roughly 3.5 megawatt, up to 10 megawatt if you're using megawatt chargers. This was not necessarily a sufficient, a load capacity for this site. Next slide, please. We also, as part of these 2 pages, also provided some details for what a planner or developer needs to expect with respect to electrical infrastructure upgrades and what sort of costs they need to be expecting. So as part of this, we looked at both on the electric distribution service, like the type of transformer that needs to be upgraded, the meter, the panels, switch gears, EV chargers themselves. And also, we also looked at the possibility for the cost of potential DER system, like solar PV with battery energy storage systems, and provided some rough cost estimates at the very high level on what a developer should expect when it comes to building out a charging site like this. Next slide, please. So with those site assessments, really our goal, as I said at the beginning of my set of slides, was really to providing everyone with examples of like how this could look like, and if they are picking another site, how they could go through this process of understanding the economics, understanding the cost, understanding the suitability of it, and what other considerations they need to, what other factors they need to consider, for example, doing site visits and other things in order to make sure that this is a suitable site for them. But then what do you need to expect, when you're going into a site development, especially with the utility coordinations? Developing a charging site, especially for medium and heavy duty vehicles, is not something that can be done overnight. This is the chart on the right-hand side is just an example of the chart based on the timeline provided by some of the investor-owned utilities in California in terms of how long it could take for site development. And this is a site that doesn't necessarily need a substation upgrade. So typically on the design side, you can expect anywhere between 3 to 9 months, and then on the construction side of the sites, you can expect anywhere between 6 months to 2 years for the development sites. I know of sites that has been developed within a year and sites that actually took 4 years for them to be developed. But the very first thing any developer or any funding agency or anyone that is really going into the process of building out the site needs to do is to notify their utilities. Utility upgrades are always taking time. Although California, luckily we have regulations in place that requires our utilities to act early and provide the needed power and energization rules. However, there are in certain cases, especially with these large projects, that needs like megawatts of additional load capacity. There is a significant amount of upgrades needed to the infrastructure in order to provide those powers. And the very first thing is really to engage with utility, plan for those load growth, and really align with its utility based on the program, specifically the programs that they're offering, such as, for example, in Southern California, the Charge Ready Transport Program, really trying to hop on those programs and being able to not only benefit from the incentives, but also notify the utility in terms of the expected load growth so they can be ready, they can include those in their plans, and they can also support you with the energizations of those facilities. Next one. Aside from the utility coordination, there are also a lot of considerations around the permitting and constructions. When you're picking a site, definitely make sure your site is meeting the local zoning laws. If the site complies, it has sufficient space for truck maneuverability, look at the site, conduct the site assessments, check the permitting requirements, work closely with the local authorities, cities on the electrical and construction permitting process, as well as the environmental process, whether the site requires a CEQA, NEPA type of work, because those environmental processes could significantly delay your projects. Make sure you're doing well on the construction planning timelines. Again, construction of these sites is not necessarily an overnight thing. It takes time. It needs a lot of coordination with utility. And one most important thing is that whenever anyone is trying to get into the development of these sites, always consider the future expansion and scalability of these sites. You don't want to dig and trench 5 times over the life of over life of these chargers in order to add chargers. I mean, if you are adding chargers, try to think about where you want to be in 2035, where you want to be in 2040, and bring the necessary electrical infrastructure, at least on the facility side, so that anytime you need to add chargers, you're ready to do that. You can notify your utility, they are ready to do that, and you can expand as the adoption of EVs across the state and across the region increases. With that, I think I'll now pass it back to Jonathan.
Great. Thanks, Sam. I want to do a quick time check with Grid Alternatives and CalSTART. Do we have the time to briefly go over the charging demand results, or do we want to wrap up?
I think if in the interest of time, given that we are coming up on the hour, if maybe we could start wrapping up and see if there are any remaining questions that folks have before we close out.
Okay, great. Oh, I can go through this then. Great, if folks have time. So really quickly, I'll go over is that a yes? Is that a no? Who's it? Giovanna?
Oh, I thought you meant like wrap up, like any closing remarks you had to speed through. Like if you want to speed through real quick, that I know you have
Sure.
like, yeah.
Okay, great. Just wanted to respect everyone's time. Okay, so really quickly, so here, I'm going to really quickly go over the charging demand for 2030, 2035, and 2040. So this is 2030, kind of developing where we expect around the ports and sort of heading out eastward. Next slide, please. These will be really quick. 2035 really starts to kind of build up, especially heading out towards San Bernardino and Riverside. This ties in with future warehouse development that's expected from the modeling work. And then next slide, please. So then in 2040, you start to see sort of pathways both north and further east, seeing additional charging demand, basically as long haul fleets continue to convert to zero emission vehicles. What I want to note here is all of these charging demand assumptions built in the Advanced Clean Fleets, ACF, those timelines into place. With the withdrawal of the waiver from the EPA, this does two things. One, it sort of slows down the implementation and deployment of some of this infrastructure and fleet conversion from the regulatory side. But the other thing that it does, and we saw this borne out in our outreach, is that most operators, OEMs, utilities just felt like they needed a little bit more time, that some of these timelines were very aggressive. This builds out that ramp, right? You've potentially got 4 or more years till we don't know exactly what CARB is going to do with their waiver, but this does build in that development time. We know this continues to be a major goal for California to convert their truck fleet to zero emissions. So there's both pros and cons here, but we should really view this as an opportunity. So, and this is modeling public peak hourly demand, but there's also kind of total demand that's needed throughout the region. And so that total demand is higher, and that's represented by operators that are charging sort of at their depots, or what's called behind the fence charging. So this is not charging where folks are out, kind of pulling over and charging. That depot charging is, implemented and built out by private companies. Next slide, please. So this looks a little different, but that's okay. Gonna really quickly throw some numbers at you so you can see from 2030 to 2035 in the middle, and then 2040, you see the demand roughly a little more than doubling between 2030 and 2035. And this is as kind of the long haul fleet sort of starts to electrify. And then by 2040, we're basically assuming, I think it was somewhere around 75 to 95% of all trucks on road would be zero emissions. There's some legacy vehicles that are still there. Los Angeles County, San Bernardino County, and Riverside are driving a lot of that demand. The interesting thing there is they're begins to be a lot more dependence on public charging, as long-haul fleets in the region typically don't have a home base they can go and charge at a private location. They're making their drop off and then heading out again, so they're going to need that public charging even more as they begin to electrify. So it'll also be dependent on other parts of the country, both in the Southwest and then sort of across the nation, beginning to build out that infrastructure to support long-haul fleets being able to charge at any point in their journey, not just Southern California. So next slide, please. And really quickly, I want to focus on one county, San Bernardino. You can see in the map on the left, the little blue dots highlight where there's potential site locations. They're located along, major interstates and around major freight facilities. But the charts on the right show that you can meet that demand with a couple of different combinations of chargers. You can implement sort of a broad spectrum of low, medium, and high power chargers, which again serves the needs. It may extend charging times a little bit for middle of the day fleets, who are just needing a quick top off. But those lower power chargers also sort of meet the demands of overnight charging without requiring, like Sam talked about, those costly sort of long-term grid upgrades. A lot of those 150 and even 350 kilowatt chargers can be implemented now with off-the-shelf equipment, just making sure you've got a site with enough capacity. The alternative being you focus more on the higher power end. So it takes a little bit longer to develop because of the cost and time scale for building out that grid capacity. But then you have a lot of vehicles who can charge quickly, medium duty, heavy duty, long haul, sort of regardless of sort of what their needs are, they've got that higher power built out. So there's different ways this infrastructure can get built out. It really depends on how much we want implemented in the near term now, but then thinking about that sort of future capacity expansion as we're putting infrastructure on the ground. So this will also depend on how specific counties or the region wants to prioritize certain truck markets, right? They have different operational requirements. How it manages its overall sort of peak load, right? This energy demand is happening at the same time as all other energy consumption for all other different industries and sectors. So regions have to keep that in mind. And we're saying, great, we're going to install, 100 truck chargers, but it's in an area that also has really high, say, like industrial electricity demand or really high residential demand, maybe that's located near a lot of multifamily. So kind of keeping that in mind, like when those peaks of energy demand happen and how that lines up with how the trucks are charging. Next slide, please. But that's all we got. That's our website right there. If you want to look at summaries of the project, we've got TAC meeting minutes, fact sheets, and other information. You can reach out to me at that email address if you'd like further information. And really, SCAG's goal here is just to use all of this work as a way to support other agencies, other jurisdictions, other organizations, who want to move forward on zero emissions truck charging, but maybe either don't have the resources or the time. We try to do a lot of the work ahead of time to support others. So, please reach out if you have questions, want more information, or are interested in partnering. And I want to thank Sam for agreeing to support me on this presentation today. His team was instrumental, and I really appreciate, Liz, your team at CalSTART and the EPRI team who, kind of helped the ZETI team work through all of this. And then, of course, Grid Alternatives, just thanks for inviting us to participate and get this information out to as many people as possible.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to you, Jonathan and Sam, for lending us your time, your expertise, and getting to share all of this wonderful information to our CTAC members, so that folks could get acquainted with the process. So this is super crucial information. We really thank you. Gia, if you can take us to the next slides, next step slides, excuse me. Just to wrap up, just because we are on out of time now, want to thank you all for joining us today. Wanted to all let you know that for the next CTAC meeting, the next quarterly one, that date and time is still to be determined. We are going to organize a joint CTAC and WEDAC meeting. It'll be the one time where we will get folks together in person. And we're looking to do this at a charging hub facility so that we can take a tour of a facility, get to see medium and heavy duty trucks charging, perhaps get to see an MCS charger live and see how that works, how it plugs in, how it charges. and then have a small program for folks and provide lunch as well on this day. Again, it'll be, I know all of our meetings have been virtual. This will be the one time that we get to have everyone in person, and we're really excited to planning this for you all. So stay tuned for more details to come on that. As Gia mentioned, we have our next industry partner webinar series presentation, EV Site Planning 101 with Zeem Solutions on April 9th. We'll send out reminder emails and calendar invite for that real soon. As always, we'll follow up with a copy of the presentation and meeting summary and link to the recording of this meeting so that you all can get to review at your leisure. Thank you all once again, and we will be in touch. And until next time, take care. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.